Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a chamber that looks more like a stage than a bedroom. Lanterns swing low from wooden beams, their flames throwing shadows across stone walls draped in faded tapestries. 8. The smell of wax and smoke mixes with the musk of too many bodies crowded into one space. You hear footsteps, laughter, the creak of benches as townsfolk and noblemen alike squeeze closer for a view. Yes, a view, because tonight is not about privacy. Tonight is about proof. And in the medieval world, a marriage bed was never truly yours alone. You probably won't survive this kind of wedding night, not unless you have nerves of steel and no fear of being watched. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is. Share it down below. It's because it always amazes me how far these bedtime stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward across uneven floorboards, your sandals slipping slightly on rushes strewn across the ground. The hall is heavy with anticipation, as though the air itself holds its breath. On a dais at the far end sits the bridal couple stiff as statues. The bride's veil hangs low, her hands folded in her lap, trembling faintly. The groom fiddles with his sleeves, avoiding every pair of eyes. They know what's coming, and so do you. This is not merely a celebration, it is a test, a spectacle. A ritual meant to transform personal intimacy into a public confirmation of alliance. Historians often argue about how widespread such public rituals really were. Some chronicles insist that every noble marriage was marked by witnesses crowding into the bridal chamber. Others suggest exaggeration, claiming that only the most important unions required such formality. Still, the stories persist, enough to paint an image that is both absurd and terrifying. Imagine your wedding night becoming the hottest ticket in town, with neighbors whispering and clerics muttering blessings while you try to focus on, well, the actual task at hand. You notice the torches burn lower as attendants step forward, pulling the bed's curtains wide. The bed itself seems larger than life-thick furs piled high, embroidered sheets waiting like silent judges. The bride glances toward it, as if facing a trial. The groom gulps, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, and all around them the crowd shifts, eager to witness what should never be witnessed. Someone in the corner coughs, and the sound feels obscene in the quiet. Another man chuckles, muttering a joke too low for you to hear, though the ripple of laughter tells you enough. Already the night is less about two people and more about entertainment. You step closer, your own breath shallow, as if you too are complicit. This was the dark truth of medieval marriage beds. They were less about romance, more about politics, honor, and public assurance. For noble families, a wedding wasn't just two lives joining, it was lands, titles, and bloodlines intertwining. The marriage bed was the final seal, the living contract, and the crowd was there to certify it. No wonder lanterns glowed so brightly, as though light itself was summoned to strip away secrets. Yet beneath the solemnity, you sense fear. The bride shifts her feet, her slippers scratching against the rushes. The groom bites his lip, sweat already darkening his collar. You can almost hear their thoughts. What if something goes wrong? What if we fail in front of them all? The tension is thick enough to choke on. A priest steps forward, holding a book open. His voice drones, blessing the couple, blessing the bed, blessing the act to come. You can't help but smirk. It's the strangest mix of sacred and profane. A holy benediction for something that should belong only to two people. But in this hall, it belongs to everyone. And as the blessing fades, a silence heavier than stone falls across the chamber. The bride lifts her head. The groom rises. Together they are led toward the bed as though walking toward a throne or an execution platform. The crowd leans forward. You lean forward, and in that moment, you realize the medieval marriage bed was never just furniture, it was theater, trial and testimony, all under the dim glow of flickering lanterns. The murmur of the hall thickens as the attendants take hold of the bride and groom, not roughly, but with the officious confidence of people accustomed to shepherding couples toward a ritual no one dares refuse. You find yourself caught between fascination and secondhand dread. The so-called bedding ceremony has begun, and while it sounds like a quiet affair, Here it feels more like a public play where the script is already written. The guests crowd closer, pressing against the timber posts, their cheeks flushed from wine and anticipation. Some hold candles aloft, their wax dripping onto the floor, each flame another watchful eye. The bride is guided to the edge of the bed, her veil trembling as if alive. The groom is nudged forward with a few hearty claps on the back, which only deepen the scarlet flush across his face. You almost pity him. Nothing kills the mood quite like a hall of relatives egging you on. Historians often point out that bedding ceremonies varied in detail. In some regions, the ritual was symbolic. Guests escorted the couple to their chamber, placed them on the bed, and then departed, leaving the rest to privacy. In others, the line of modesty blurred dangerously. Attendants might remain long enough to remove garments, offer blessings, or worse, stay until the couple was under the covers. Chroniclers from France and Germany write of laughter, bawdy songs, even wagers placed on how quickly the act would be accomplished. Scholars still argue whether these accounts describe everyday custom or exaggerated anecdotes meant to titillate readers. You watch as attendants circle the bride, fingers tugging gently at the outer layers of her gown. The fabric peels away in slow ceremony, each ribbon untied not by her husband, but by chosen women of the household. Their faces are unreadable, part solemn duty, part mischievous delight. The groom, too, is guided through similar motions, boots tugged off, cloak slipped from his shoulders, tunic loosened. Every step is narrated in whispers and snickers, as though intimacy itself has been hijacked for communal amusement. The strangeness of it strikes you. Something meant to unite two bodies is instead dividing them from themselves. You can feel the bride's hands trembling, hidden in her sleeves. The way her eyes flick from the floor to the crowd and back again. The groom swallows hard, pretending bravery he doesn't feel. You imagine their thoughts tangled like vines. What if we falter? What if we become a joke, whispered for generations? One elderly guest calls out a rhyme, some crude verse about fertility and strength, and the hall erupts in laughter. You sigh softly. People haven't changed much. Even today, in awkward wedding speeches or drunken toasts, humor often teeters on the edge of cruelty. Medieval folk were no different. They simply had fewer curtains to hide behind. And yet, amidst the noise, you sense an undercurrent of sacredness. A priest offers a brief prayer, muttering Latin over the couple, as if to sanctify the fumbling ritual. The contradiction makes you chuckle. Holy words coding a decidedly unholy spectacle. Still, to those present, the blessing is no joke. It marks the moment as not just a union of flesh, but of families, lands, and fortunes. Without this ritual, the marriage would remain incomplete, an alliance unsealed. The couple finally lie side by side on the bed, still clothed in linen, though stripped of outer finery. Attendants draw the covers up to their chins with almost maternal care. A cheer rises, loud and raucous, as though the crowd has scored a victory of its own. Some guests will depart now, satisfied that appearances have been upheld. Others linger, reluctant to surrender the theater. You feel the heat of the room pressing in, the cloying mix of perfume, sweat, and candle smoke. Historians still debate how much of this was symbolic pageantry, and how much was intrusive reality. Were the crowds always this involved, or only at high-profile unions where dynasties were at stake? The records disagree, but standing here in imagination, you sense the truth was messy, shifting from village to village, century to century. A lantern's flicker, the crowd begins to disperse, and the hall slowly exhales its tension. But the echoes remain, the clapping, the laughter, the prayers stitched awkwardly between. You realize the bedding ceremony was less about two hearts and more about binding a contract before witnesses. The couple may lie in bed, but it is the entire community that tucks them in. You step back, the image burned into your mind. This is not romance, it is ritual, a spectacle dressed in lace and shadows. And it is only the beginning of the long, uneasy night. The crowd thins, but does not vanish. You stand at the edge of the chamber, your eyes adjusting to the dim light, and realize that what comes next is even more unnerving than the laughter and the stripping. For in many medieval traditions, it was not enough to lead the couple to bed. They needed witnesses, clerics, and sometimes even high-ranking nobles to remain close, ensuring that what was supposed to happen actually did. Privacy, the modern luxury you take for granted, was a concept foreign to this stage of the night. You hear the rustle of robes as a priest shifts closer, his hands folded over a book that smells of old parchment and candle wax. His presence here might strike you as absurd. After all, religion so often warns against lust that here he stands, the appointed guardian of legitimacy. Without consummation, the marriage remains incomplete, and without a clerical eye to bless the union, the act risks being just flesh without sacrament. You glance at him and suppress a smile. Perhaps even he feels the strangeness. Those centuries of repetition have dulled his unease. Noble witnesses lean in as well, their eyes narrowed, their expressions serious. To them, this is no scandalous entertainment. 'Tis verification, proof that alliances are sealed and dowries justified. Land, wealth, and future heirs all hinge on what happens under these sheets. You almost laugh at the weight of its centuries of politics balanced precariously on the nervous shoulders of two people barely out of adolescence. Historians record that in France and England, especially among royal families, such witnesses might actually remain in the room, seated in corners, until the couple had at least lain together beneath the covers. Some accounts suggest they listened for sounds of intimacy, while others claim they inspected the bed afterward for signs of consummation. Scholars still argue whether these descriptions reflect everyday reality or only the most ceremonious occasions. Perhaps it was both, depending on how paranoid the families involved were. The bride shifts nervously under the linen, her fingers clutching the edge of the sheet as though it were a lifeline. The groom forces a smile, though you can see the tightness in his jaw. They are not actors by choice, yet tonight the entire hall demands a performance. You imagine their hearts racing, each beat echoing like a drum louder than the hushed whispers outside. An attendant stirs the fire, sparks leaping into the dark. The glow illuminates the faces of the witnesses, stern, expectant, utterly unamused. You suppress another chuckle. It's like watching examiners prepare to grade the most awkward test imaginable. No amount of textbooks or tutors could prepare the couple for this moment. The priest clears his throat and mutters a final blessing, urging fertility, urging strength, urging duty above all else. You think about how love, that fragile thing, has no seat at this table. This night is about heirs and inheritance, not tender whispers. The irony makes you sigh softly. Imagine explaining to a modern couple that their wedding night would take place under the gaze of clergy and cousins. It's enough to make most people sprint for the hills. Yet, to medieval families, the presence of witnesses was reassurance. It protected brides from accusations of refusal and grooms from suspicions of impotence. It gave parents proof that their investments in dowries and alliances were not in vain. In their eyes, a little embarrassment was a small price to pay for certainty. Still, you can't shake the discomfort. The couple's breaths grow shallow, their bodies stiff beneath the sheets. The chamber feels more like a courtroom than a bedroom, every glance a verdict waiting to fall. You half expect someone to start scribbling notes on parchment, tallying the time, the movements, the size. Historians still debate the degree of intrusion, but the truth is clear enough. The medieval marriage bed was a communal concern, not a private one. To you it seems absurd, even cruel, but to them it was duty, ritual, and necessity. The witnesses remained seated, silent as stone, and you realize that for the bride and groom, this silence must weigh more heavily than any laughter. 100 eyes could be mocking, but a few solemn stares are unbearable. You shiver, not from cold, but from the echo of their unease. The lanterns flicker lower, shadows stretching across the bed. And still the priest, the nobles, the attendants remain, their patience infinite, their expectations immovable. You understand now why this ritual haunted generations. Not for what it required, but for the eyes that refused to look away. The fire crackles low, and you shift your weight uneasily as the ritual grows stranger still. The couple lies beneath the linen, but the ceremony is far from over. Attendants move quietly, as though the act of disrobing is not yet complete, when in many traditions, the stripping of garments became its own spectacle, carried out not by the bride or groom, but by trusted hands that seemed far too eager to turn intimacy into theater. You watch as women from the bride's household step forward. Their fingers find the knots and ribbons that hold the last layers of her dress in place. They loosen them slowly, deliberately, while the hall murmurs approval. The bride's cheeks burn crimson, though whether from embarrassment or the heat of so many eyes you cannot say. She sits stiffly, enduring the ritual with the patience of someone who knows resistance would only make it worse. The groom, too, is not spared. His attendants tug at his tunic, slipping it from his shoulders with practiced motions, laughing softly as though to ease the tension. But the laughter rings hollow, for there is no easing what it feels like to be undressed before a crowd. You feel the weight of secondhand shame pressing on your chest. Historians note that in parts of France, Germany, and even England, this disrobing was often ceremonial rather than complete. The couple might be left in simple linen shifts, decent enough for public eyes, yet stripped of finery as a symbolic shedding of worldly status. Others argue that some accounts exaggerate, describing body parodies where guests tugged playfully at sleeves or stockings, turning the sacred moment into carnival. Scholars still debate whether these were isolated jokes or genuine customs, but the stories linger. You imagine the strangeness of it. Attendants humming little songs as they fold away heavy velvet gowns. The hush of fabric sliding from skin, the faint gasp of a bride clutching at her modesty. Every detail transforms the private act of preparing for bed into a performance judged by dozens. You almost laugh at the absurdity. Who could possibly feel amorous in such conditions? But then you'll remember. It was never about romance. It was about proof. The bed looms behind them, piled high with furs and linen, waiting like a stage prop. The stripping is not foreplay. It is preparation for witnesses. Each removed ribbon signals another step toward consummation as contract, as duty. You find yourself wondering how often couples whispered resentments in their hearts. Resentment toward families who orchestrated the show. Resentment toward guests who treated it as entertainment. Resentment toward history itself for stealing their privacy. One of the older attendants cracks a joke about fertility, and the hall chuckles. You shake your head. Even now, centuries later, you can feel how humor must have landed like salt on wounds. The couple is expected to smile, to accept the teasing, to embody grace under scrutiny. But the tension in their shoulders betrays them. See the bride's knuckles whiten as she clutches the sheet. The groom's jaw tighten, as though he would rather face a battlefield than this bed. The stripping ritual ends at last, leaving them swaddled in simple linen. The garments of wealth and ceremony lie folded in careful stacks, as though reminding them that their duty is greater than their comfort. Attendants bow slightly, stepping back, leaving the couple half-bared and wholly vulnerable. The crowd hums with satisfaction. The stage has been set. Historians still argue whether such rituals were meant to humiliate or to bless. Perhaps they were both. Stripping away finery could symbolize purity, a return to the simple beginnings of husband and wife. Yet when done before a jeering audience, it feels less like blessing and more like cruelty, disguised as tradition. You exhale slowly, realizing that the dark truth of medieval marriage beds is not just the act itself, but the relentless exposure. To be stripped, witnessed, and judged before ever touching one another, this was the burden couples carried. And as the fire sputters and the sheets are drawn higher, you know the night has only begun to unravel. The chamber grows still for a moment, as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. You shift your gaze from the bed to the circle of faces surrounding it, and what you see is a strange mix of solemnity and amusement. Priests murmur blessings, their voices heavy with Latin, while a few drunken guests whisper jokes, stifling their laughter behind their hands. This is the part of the night when public prayers meet private fears, and the line between holy ritual and human awkwardness blurs like candle smoke in the air. The bride lies rigid beneath the linen, her veil cast aside, her face pale as chalk. You imagine the thoughts racing through her mind how much of this night is hers, and how much belongs to the dozens of eyes watching. The groom fidgets, pulling the sheets higher. But every move feels magnified, every sigh an announcement. They are not two people about to discover each other, or two actors, bound to play roles neither of them rehearsed. Historians note that prayers at this moment often invoked fertility, protection, and divine approval. Clerics would bless the union with words that painted consummation as sacred duty, yet the juxtaposition is almost comical. You picture the priest solemnly invoking heavenly aid, while a group of young men in the back elbow one another, trying not to burst out laughing. Even medieval chroniclers admit to the tension: too much solemnity risked boredom, too much jest risked sacrilege. Balancing the two became its own awkward art. One story from Germany speaks of a priest who accidentally mispronounced a blessing, turning fruitful union into fruitful onions. The guests roared with laughter, and the embarrassed couple buried their faces in the sheets. Scholars still argue whether such anecdotes reflect real mishaps or were later embellishments meant to poke fun at clerical pomp. But the image lingers because who among us hasn't felt the sting of ill-timed humor in the middle of a serious moment? You step closer, catching the bride's shallow breaths, the way her lips move as if whispering her own private prayer. Perhaps she begs for strength, perhaps for swiftness, perhaps for invisibility. The groom squeezes his eyes shut, his knuckles pressing white against the fabric. To them, the holy words are less comfort than reminder. Failure here is not just personal, it is political, social, eternal. A misstep tonight could ripple across generations. The priest finishes his benediction, his hand raised in blessing. The hall answers with murmurs of amen. Yet even as the sacred words fade, the unease remains. Some guests glance toward the sheets with expectation, others exchange knowing smirks. You can feel the weight pressing down on the couple, as though the entire room demands a miracle of flesh and spirit. And here lies the cruel truth. Intimacy that should be tender is transformed into obligation, into performance under watchful eyes. Love is nowhere to be found in this script. Instead, there is fear, there is duty, there is the relentless expectation that Bodhi's will do what politics requires. You almost laugh at the absurdity of it all. Imagine being told that your most private moment is also your family's public business. The medieval world excelled at that kind of contradiction. The candles sputter, their flames bending low, as though exhausted by the weight of ceremony. Guests begin to drift toward the exits, though a handful linger, whispering and chuckling. The priest closes his book with a snap, the sound sharp as judgment. The bride turns her face into the pillow, hiding from their eyes. The groom swallows hard, his breath ragged. And you stand there, watching a ritual that is equal parts blessing and cruelty, realizing that the medieval marriage bed was less about love than about proving obedience to family, to church, to society itself. The guests trickle out slowly, their chatter echoing down the hallways, leaving behind an uncanny silence that settles over the chamber like a heavy cloak. You might think the couple is finally alone, but no tradition still holds them captive. What remains now is the dreaded test, the proof demanded not by love, but by law. It's not by desire, but by custom, the test of virginity. You glance at the bed, the sheets white as snow, their surface waiting like a witness, eager to testify. The bride's hands tremble as she clutches the linen, and you can almost hear her heartbeat over the dying crackle of the fire. The groom, too, seems stiff with dread, his breath uneven, his lips pressed into a thin line. They know, as you do, that their private act must leave a public mark. Historians explain that, in many regions, the bride's virginity was treated not as personal dignity, but as proof of family honor. A bloodstain on the sheets became evidence of purity, a guarantee that the alliance was untainted. Without it, whispers would spread like wildfire. Families might demand annulments, dowries could be contested, reputations destroyed. You almost laugh at the absurdity. Imagine your entire social worth hinging on the outcome of one moment in one bed. But the truth was harsher. Chroniclers describe attendants waiting outside the chamber, ready to seize the sheets at dawn and display them for all to see. Some even mention them paraded through the streets. Proof of virtue hung out like banners. Scholars still argue how widespread such practices were. Some insist they were common, especially among nobility. Others believe the tales were exaggerated or symbolic. Either way, the fear they inspired was very real. You watch as the bride closes her eyes, perhaps praying not for romance but for anatomy to cooperate. The groom wipes sweat from his brow, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of expectation. They are no longer two young people. They are vessels of reputation, carriers of family honor, trapped in a ritual that leaves no room for tenderness. And what of the nights when no stain appeared? Historians record stories of frantic remedies. A pricked finger smeared across linen, a hidden vial of animal blood discreetly spilled, anything to preserve appearances. You can almost picture a nervous maid slipping into the chamber with such contraband. Whispering instructions, her eyes darting toward the door. Were these stories truth or rumor? Scholars disagree, but the fact that they exist at all reveals the desperation of those who feared disgrace. You shift your weight uneasy. The intimacy of this moment is unbearable, not because of passion, but because of pressure. The sheets have become an exam paper, the bed a courtroom, the couple defendants in a trial judged by stains. You smirk despite yourself. Only in the medieval world could romance be so thoroughly ruined by laundry. Outside, faint footsteps echo in the corridor. You imagine servants pacing, ears straining for any sign, any sound, anything to report. Inside, the couple lies still, frozen between duty and dread. The candles gutter low, their wax dripping like silent tears. The truth presses on you. This was not a wedding night, but an ordeal. A test cloaked in sanctity. The blood-stained sheet was never about the couple's bond, it was about control. It's about proving obedience to families, to communities, to the ever-watchful eyes of society. Love, again, is nowhere to be found. Only fear, ritual, and the faint tragic hope of survival. The chamber smells of smoke and wax, yet underneath lingers something sharper, the stench of fear. You feel it pressing down on the bride and groom as they lie beneath the linen, stiff as statues. The silence is unbearable, heavy with expectation. And then comes the cruelest truth of all. Not every couple can rise to the occasion. And when the body falters, humiliation arrives like an uninvited guest. You lean closer, almost able to hear the groom's breath falter. His jaw clenches, his hands twitch. And you know the weight of eyes both remembered and anticipated has smothered whatever spark of desire might have flickered. Performance is hard enough when private. Here, with priests muttering outside and servants waiting for blood on linen, the odds are stacked against him. You almost want to pat his shoulder, whisper that anyone would struggle in his shoes. But the medieval world had no sympathy for failure. Historians tell of men labeled impotent after a single difficult night, their reputations shattered, their marriages annulled by church courts. In some cases, trials followed, yes, literal trials of virility, where grooms were forced to prove themselves before witnesses or doctors. You chuckle at the absurdity, but the reality was cruel. To be branded incapable was to lose not just a wife, but honor, land, and often freedom. The bride's plight was no gentler. If blood failed to appear, the burden of shame fell on her shoulders. Whispers of prior sin, of hidden lovers, of disgrace would trail her like a curse. Some brides wept openly, begging for mercy. Others sought desperate tricks, smearing red dye, feigning illness, anything to divert suspicion. Scholars still argue how often such scandals actually occurred, but the fact that they haunt records and folktales alike tells you they were feared enough to shape behavior. You picture the scene, dawn breaking, servants rushing in to collect the unstained sheet, faces tight with panic, a father fuming, a mother sobbing, guests whispering like vultures circling. For the couple, the wedding night becomes not memory, but verdict. Their futures rewritten by what the linen failed to reveal. Sometimes failure sparked cruelty. Chroniclers mention Bodhi songs composed at the expense of unfortunate couples, verses sung in taverns for years afterward. Imagine your most private humiliation turned into a drinking song. You sigh, shaking your head. Medieval humor had sharp teeth, and shame was its favorite meal. And yet, not all was merciless. Some families hushed up failures, quietly offering second chances. Doctors might be summoned, herbs prescribed, saints petitioned, but even mercy carried weight. Every attempt a reminder that the bed was less a sanctuary than a battlefield, and defeat could never be entirely hidden. The couple beneath the linen lie frozen, and you can almost feel their dread seeping into your own skin. For them, success means survival, and failure means a lifetime of whispers. You exhale slowly, realizing the medieval marriage bed was as much about endurance as desire. It demanded proof not of love, but of compliance with society's harshest expectations. The candles burn lower, the silence deepens, and you know this ordeal is far from finished. What should have been tenderness has become trial, and the night stretches endlessly, cruel in its demands. The night lengthens, and you sense that the tension in this chamber is not unique to ordinary couples. For if common folk dreaded the scrutiny of neighbors, kings and queens bore that weight multiplied 100-fold. Royal weddings, you realize, amplified the bedding ritual into something even grander. even more intrusive, as though the fate of kingdoms depended on what unfolded between the sheets. You imagine a great hall in France or England, tapestries fluttering in torchlight, courtiers whispering beneath their jeweled collars. Here, the bride and groom are not merely the people, they are dynasties. Their bodies carry treaties, armies, and borders. You chuckle softly at the absurdity, the might of nations, reduced to whether a nervous teenager can perform under pressure. Yet such was the medieval world's logic. Historians record examples where entire courts attended the bedding. In France, witnesses might remain in the room while attendants pulled the sheets over the royal pair. Chroniclers note that when Henry VIII of England wed Anne of Cleves, his failure to consummate the marriage became political ammunition. The king himself complained about her body and her smells, though scholars still argue whether it was his reluctance, his health, or pure political maneuvering. Regardless, the marriage was annulled, and the bedding bed became a battlefield of words, as sharp as swords. In Spain, accounts of royal weddings tell of priests inspecting sheets at dawn, eager to confirm the queen's virginity had been surrendered. A single stain of blood might secure alliances. The lack of one could unravel treaties crafted over decades. Imagine ambassadors riding home across Europe, carrying news not of armies or battles, but of what did or did not happen in a royal bed. You almost laugh, except the stakes were far too grim. The bride in such unions bore the heaviest weight. Failure to prove virginity could mean disgrace, annulment, even accusations of treason. Queens were expected not only to produce heirs, but to embody purity, their very body symbols of dynastic legitimacy. Sheet without blood might topple her, while a successful bedding secured her throne. The groom, too, faced dangers. A king unable or unwilling to consummate risked whispers of impotence, a stain that no crown could fully erase. Chroniclers mention mocking verses sung in taverns, courtiers snickering behind fans, rivals sharpening their knives. For royalty, the marriage bed was as much a battlefield as any field of war. You step back from the imagined royal chamber, the weight of history pressing hard. In these moments, the absurd becomes tragic, the personal turned into national drama. Love is not only absent, it is irrelevant. The act is stripped bare, demanded as proof of political legitimacy. The candles gutter and the room smells of wax and sweat. You sigh softly, realizing how fragile power could be when reduced to sheets and stains. The medieval marriage bed was not merely a stage for duet, it was an arena in which entire nations leaned forward, waiting for victory or humiliation. And as you picture the young royals lying stiff beneath the covers, you understand why history remembers their nights less as love stories and more as cautionary tales. The chamber you walk through now feels less like a bedroom and more like a council chamber. Every glance, every sigh, every rustle of sheets seems weighted with consequences far beyond the couple themselves. For in the medieval world, what happened in the marriage bed did not stay there. It spilled outward into politics, alliances, and sometimes even the fate of dynasties. Imagine a French princess wedded to an English prince, their union meant to end wars and bind crowns together. You picture the long banquet table, the ink still drying on treaties, the guests raising goblets in forced cheer. Then behind closed doors, the silence stretches too long, the sheets yield no stain. Whispers begin to slither through the halls like smoke. Suddenly, an alliance meant to last generations trembles on the outcome of a single night. Historians point to the marriage of Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their union was fraught, their intimacy questioned, and eventually their marriage was annulled. On grounds of consanguinity, too closely related, the church claimed, yet beneath the legal excuse lay rumors of incompatibility in bed. Scholars still debate whether those whispers held truth, but the fact that marital intimacy could be wielded as political leverage speaks volumes. In England, you recall, Henry VIII made a career out of turning beds into battlegrounds. His annulment from Catherine of Aragon hinged on arguments that their union had not been properly consummated. When she was briefly married to his brother, the king's desperation for heirs transformed intimate questions into public debate, with bishops, lawyers, and ambassadors dissecting what two people had not done years earlier. You smirk, realizing how medieval gossip became a weapon sharp enough to cleave kingdoms apart. Even lesser nobles were not spared. Chronicles tell of annulments sought by lords who claimed their brides were not virgins, their reputations shattered before entire courts. Some women defended themselves fiercely, swearing oaths, summoning witnesses, even demanding medical examinations. Others fell silent, their voices drowned by the tidal wave of suspicion. The marriage bed became a courtroom where verdicts shaped inheritances and feuds. You imagine the bride in such a trial, her eyes wide, her future balanced precariously on testimony about her body. Imagine the groom, his pride injured, choosing honor over compassion. Families lined up behind them, each with fortunes and reputations at stake. You almost laugh at how absurd it seems, yet the laughter dies quickly. The cruelty of such trials was very real, and still, scholars argue about the frequency of these ordeals. Were they everyday events, or rare dramas that chroniclers exaggerated for effect? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. But standing here, in your mind's medieval chamber, you can feel how the pressure of politics crept into every sigh beneath the sheets. The air grows heavier, as though the stone walls themselves record every failure and triumph. You sigh, realizing that in this world a marriage was never just between two people. It was a pact sealed with flesh, judged by witnesses, and enforced by the machinery of politics. Love had little room to breathe. Instead, fear and ambition pressed close, whispering louder than any tender vow. The candles flicker, shadows dancing across tapestries of knights and saints. And you understand that the medieval marriage bed was not just a stage for ritual humiliation, it was the axis upon which entire dynasties spun. Sometimes until they unraveled, the fire has burned low, casting long shadows that crawl across the walls like silent judges. You linger in the chamber, but your thoughts drift to what happens when the ordeal of the marriage bed ends badly, or even well. The whispers do not stay within the stone walls. They spill outward, gathering weight, transforming into satire songs, and jokes that echo in streets and taverns long after the sheets have been folded away. You imagine a tavern in Paris, thick with smoke and laughter. A bard strums a lute, weaving crude verses about a noble groom who failed to perform on his wedding night. The crowd roars, mugs slam against wooden tables, and reputations crumble beneath the rhythm of rhyme.
What
Was once a private humiliation becomes public theater. You smirk, though uneasily. You know too well how humor sharpens when aimed at the vulnerable. Historians note that satire was one of the most common weapons of medieval culture. Chroniclers recorded bawdy limericks about kings, impugned bishops for their appetites, and mocked brides who entered marriage unworthy. Some of these verses survive in manuscripts, scribbled in margins with ink that has outlasted the people it shamed. Scholars still debate whether these accounts exaggerate, but even the possibility reveals how fragile a couple's dignity was in the face of ridicule. The bride who failed to bleed, the groom who failed to rise, both became fodder for gossip. You can picture servants whispering behind tapestries, maids smirking as they spread tales to neighbors, minstrels turning scandal into entertainment. A single night's stumble could haunt a couple for decades. You almost laugh at how little people have changed. Even today, social media thrives on such gossip, though now it's tweets instead of tavern songs. And yet the cruelty was not always malicious. Sometimes humor softened the unbearable. Guests might sing to ease tension, making light of a situation that was otherwise suffocating. A bawdy joke could shift shame into shared laughter, at least for a moment. But laughter has sharp edges, and what soothed one night could cut deep the next. You watch the couple in your mind's eye, their shoulders rigid beneath linen, aware that their future is being scripted not just by witnesses but by the gossip already forming beyond the chamber doors. They are characters in a play they never auditioned for, their lines written in jest and judgment. Historians recall that in some villages, bedding ceremonies themselves became spectacles of parody. Guests might imitate the act, mocking gestures exaggerated for laughs. Imagine drunken uncles hopping into bed in full view, pretending to consummate while the real couple sat red-faced. It sounds absurd, and you chuckle at the picture. But for the bride and groom, it must have been mortifying. Scholars still argue whether such antics were common or rare. But their existence in records shows how blurry the line between ritual and ridicule could be. The truth sinks in. Intimacy was never safe from laughter. The medieval marriage bed was a performance judged not only by priests and nobles, but by the mouths of neighbors eager for a tale. And those tales lived longer than the moment itself, woven into songs, stories, and gossip that clung like a shadow. The candles sputter, and you exhale slowly, realizing how unbearable it must have been to carry not only duty, but also the threat of mockery. A stumble in private would be bad enough. In medieval Europe, it became legend. The night has stretched endlessly, and yet you sense that what you've seen so far is only part of the story. For the customs of bedding were not uniform across Christendom. They shifted and twisted with geography, shaped by local tradition, and sometimes by sheer whimsy. What was ritual in one land was rumor in another, and as you drift from chamber to chamber across medieval Europe, you feel the strangeness of regional variations. In France, for instance, chroniclers speak of processions, where the newlyweds were escorted not just to the bed but through the streets, surrounded by cheering townsfolk. Imagine the couple stumbling along cobbled roads while neighbors waved candles and shouted ribald blessings. Privacy was not only denied, it was paraded. The bedchamber became the endpoint of a public march, less sanctuary than finish line. In Germany, records hint at something different. There, the focus often fell on fertility rituals. Guests might scatter grain or hops across the bed, symbolic of abundance and future heirs. Some even placed children upon the couple's blankets, a strange and awkward blessing meant to ensure fertility. You smirk at the picture. Nothing says romance like a toddler plopped on your wedding sheets while a priest chants. Historians still argue whether such details were ceremonial or comedic exaggerations, but the image is unforgettable. England, too, had its quirks. Some accounts describe bedding ceremonies as more symbolic, escorting the couple into the chamber, drawing the curtains, and then leaving them alone. But others, particularly in noble households, mention witnesses lingering just long enough to confirm the pair were under the covers. The line between courtesy and intrusion blurred like the edge of a shadow. Italy brought its own flair. Renaissance accounts mention elaborate songs performed as the couple was put to bed, verses both poetic and indecent, blending art with mockery. In Spain, meanwhile, sheets were carefully preserved and displayed as family trophies, proof of honor stored like relics. You can almost see the folded linen tucked away in chests, destined to outlive the couple themselves. You walk through these imagined chambers, each variation adding another layer of absurdity. No matter the region, the theme remains the same. Intimacy transformed into ritual, duty performed beneath too many eyes. The details change: grain in one land, song in another, parades in yet another, but the pressure never eases. Scholars still debate how much of these accounts were widespread and how much were exaggerations meant to entertain. Perhaps chroniclers delighted in the scandal of it all, writing down the strangest stories precisely because they were rare. Or perhaps, in some form, these customs were so common that no one questioned their cruelty. The truth is slippery, but the impression remains. Across Europe, the marriage bed was never truly private. You sigh softly, imagining the exhaustion of couples dragged through these rituals. The laughter of neighbors, the muttered prayers, the grain scattered like confetti, all of it piled upon a night that should have been simple. You realize now that the medieval world left no corner of life untouched by communal judgment. Even love, or the faint hope of it, was bound tight in ritual and tradition. The fire sputters, the chamber flickers, and you exhale. The marriage bed, whether in France, Germany, England, or Spain, carried the same burden. Proof demanded, privacy denied, and the heavy weight of too many eyes. The chamber fades into quiet again, but your mind lingers on an unsettled question. Did all these ceremonies truly happen, as often as the stories claim? Or have we been duped by exaggeration? Historians themselves wrestle with this puzzle, their debates echoing like whispers through dusty archives. Some insist that bedding ceremonies were widespread, that chroniclers simply recorded what everyone already knew. Others argue the tales were blown out of proportion, turned into scandalous anecdotes to entertain readers. You smirk, realizing that even scholars gossip, only they call it interpretation. Take, for example, the question of witnesses. Did nobles really sit in the chamber waiting for consummation? Some records describe it vividly: lords perched on benches, clerics muttering prayers, sheets inspected at dawn. But skeptics suggest these were rare, perhaps limited to high-profile unions where politics demanded certainty. After all, most people, even medieval folk, preferred to keep at least a shred of dignity. Then there is the matter of blood-stained sheets. Chroniclers revel in tales of linens paraded through streets or displayed before courts, yet some researchers point out that biology itself makes this unreliable. It's not every bride would bleed, and not every couple would leave proof. Were the stories then more symbolic than literal? Or did communities cling to ritual regardless of its flaws? Historians still argue, flipping through manuscripts, searching for truth between the lines of scandal. You chuckle softly, imagining a group of medieval monks hunched over parchment, snickering as they penned tales of bawdy bedding ceremonies. Did they record fact, or did they embellish for amusement? Much like gossip today goes viral because it's juicy, not because it's true. The line blurs, and you realize the dark truth might lie not only in the acts themselves, but in the way they were told and retold. Yet even if some stories were exaggerated, the fear they inspired was real. Couples believed the eyes of society were upon them, whether or not they actually were. Rituals may have varied, but the pressure to prove, to display, to conform, weighed heavily. The legend itself became part of reality. People acted as though the tales were true, and in doing so, made them true enough. You stand in the chamber, the silence pressing close, and reflect on how history loves its contradictions. The bedding ceremony may have been both common and rare, both real and exaggerated, both sacred and profane. Scholars may never agree, but the uncertainty only adds to the haunting weight of the custom. You exhale, amused and unsettled in equal measure. Perhaps it doesn't matter whether every detail was fact. What matters is the impression left behind the sense that medieval marriage beds were stages, their actors unwilling, their audience relentless, their stories echoing down centuries, whether real or not. The candles flicker, their flames fragile yet stubborn, and you realize that in the end, history's whispers are as much about belief as about truth. And the belief that the bed was never private may have been the most powerful truth of all. The hall is quieter now, and in the hush you begin to wonder, was there ever space for love in this spectacle? Beneath the weight of politics, of priests and witnesses, of sheets scrutinized like contracts, could affection survive? You imagine couples who, against all odds, found tenderness in the midst of ritual. Love, however faint, sometimes softened the edges of duty. Picture a young bride and groom who, though strangers at the altar, discover a spark once the curtains are drawn. Perhaps he whispers a nervous joke, and she giggles despite herself. The tension cracks, the fear lifts, and for a moment they are not heirs or pawns, but simply two young souls bound together. Historians rarely record such moments. They prefer drama and scandal, but surely, behind the parchment silence, such stories existed. In some accounts, chroniclers hint at marriages that grew warm despite cold beginnings. A noblewoman in Burgundy reportedly defended her husband fiercely when rumors of impotence arose, swearing that he was vigorous in private, even if the sheets told no tale. Was she protecting his honor, or simply telling the truth of their quiet bond? Scholars still argue, but the loyalty in her defense suggests that affection sometimes triumphed over shame. You think of the rare occasions when couples met as childhood friends, or when families arranged unions between people already fond of one another. In those beds, though witnesses hovered and rituals pressed, the night may have held a glimmer of tenderness. You almost smile, imagining a bride squeezing her groom's hand beneath the linen, reminding him that they faced this ordeal together. Even within the harshest traditions, small rebellions of intimacy flickered. A couple might whisper prayers of their own, prayers not for heirs or honor, but for kindness and patience. They might close their eyes to the crowd and focus on the sound of each other's breathing. In those fleeting seconds, love was carved out of ritual like a candle carved from wax. Historians debate whether such tenderness mattered in the long run. Many marriages remained political tools, cold and transactional. But some grew into partnerships, friendships, even romances. The bedding ceremony, for all its cruelty, could not extinguish entirely the human capacity to care. Perhaps that is the most subversive truth, that love found ways to bloom in soil salted with fear. You step back from the imagined chamber, your heart lighter for a moment. Yes, the rituals were harsh, but human beings are stubborn creatures. They find laughter in funerals, courage in war, and sometimes love in forced unions. You exhale, amused at how resilient tenderness can be. even when history tries to smother it. The candles burn lower, the shadows lengthen, but somewhere in the flicker you catch the faint glow of affection. Not every marriage bed was dark truth. Some, against all odds, became places where duty softened into companionship, and ritual yielded to whispered kindness. The night stretches on, and you begin to notice how the ritual itself slowly loosens its grip over time. By the late medieval period, and especially into the Renaissance, the bedding ceremony starts to fade, slipping from strict necessity into quaint tradition, and eventually into gossip told with a smirk. What was once a binding act of proof begins to look old-fashioned, even embarrassing to newer generations. You picture a noble household in the 16th century. Guests still escort the couple to the chamber, still sing Bodhi songs along the corridor, still toss grain across the bed for luck. But when the curtains are drawn, fewer people linger. The crowd laughs, offers final jokes, and then actually leaves. Privacy, long denied, tiptoes back into the chamber. You smirk. Progress may be slow, but even medieval folk eventually tired of playing peeping toms. Historians trace this decline to shifting ideas about marriage itself. The church continued to emphasize consummation, but communities began to rely less on spectacle for proof. Written contracts, notarized dowries, and legal frameworks gradually replaced sheets and stains as guarantees. Scholars still argue whether the decline came from religious reform, social change, or sheer exhaustion with the absurdity of it all. Perhaps it was all three, weaving together like threads in a fraying tapestry. The bedding ceremony lingers, of course. In some villages, fragments of the tradition survive as playful pranks, guests tossing the couple into bed, teasing them with songs before slipping away. In courts, the ritual becomes symbolic, reduced to leading the couple to bed and closing the curtains. Chroniclers note that people still gossiped, still joked, but the intrusive intensity had weakened. The marriage bed, though never entirely private, begins to reclaim a little space for itself. You imagine an older noblewoman shaking her head at her grandchildren, recalling with a mixture of horror and nostalgia the days when entire households crowded into chambers. To her, the decline of the custom might seem like a loss of order, a fading of discipline. To you, it feels like common sense finally catching up. And yet, even as the ritual fades, its memory persists. Plays, poems, and folktales preserve the bawdy humor and humiliation, turning what was once law into entertainment. The bedding ceremony becomes legend, a subject for satire rather than solemnity. You can almost hear the laughter of audiences watching actors mock the ritual on stage, finding humor in the very thing that once caused dread. The chamber around you feels lighter, the air less suffocating. The worst has passed, and though shadows still stretch across the walls, they are thinner, less oppressive. The bedding ceremony, once a heavy chain, is rusting away. You exhale, realizing that this is how traditions end, not with a sudden break, but with slow erosion, one joke, one shrug, one new custom at a time. The dark truth does not vanish, but it becomes less sharp, dulled by the passing of centuries. And though the marriage bed will always carry echoes of its role in politics and honor, the silence that follows now feels almost merciful. The chamber is nearly dark now, the candles burn down to stubs, their wax hardened in small rivers across the floor. You stand quietly, listening to the faint hiss of the dying fire. And you realize you are no longer in the middle of a ritual, you are in its echo. What was once a living ordeal has become memory, legend and whisper, scattered through chronicles, and passed down as tales half grim, half absurd. You imagine the medieval couple, long gone now, lying side by side beneath linen that has crumbled to dust. Their night of fear, of judgment, of whispered prayers and silent dread is preserved only in ink and rumor. The bedding ceremony that once weighed like stone has faded into a shadow, retold by scholars, mocked by playwrights, softened by time. And yet, its traces linger not in the way people marry today, but in the way intimacy still carries the weight of expectation. Historians still debate what was real and what was embroidered for effect. Did every noble marriage demand witnesses? Were sheets paraded as proof in every village? Or were these the rare, dramatic moments recorded precisely because they were extreme? The truth hides between exaggeration and silence, between laughter and law. You chuckle softly, History has always preferred stories too strange to ignore. You step closer to the bed one last time, tracing the shape of its memory. The rituals of stripping, of blessing, of testing, all served a single purpose: to prove. To prove that unions were fertile, that families were honorable, that politics could be trusted. In the end, the couple themselves were little more than actors in a pageant directed by society. Love, if it existed, was an unscripted improvisation in the margins. The fire collapses into ash, and the air grows cool. You realize that the dark truth of medieval marriage beds is not simply that they were humiliating or invasive, but that they reveal how little privacy once belonged to individuals. What you now consider sacred intimacy, affection, vulnerability, was once a public performance judged by priests, parents, and gossiping neighbors. And in that reflection lies the strange comfort that progress, however slow, is real. You exhale softly, letting the weight of centuries slip away. The bed before you is empty, its sheets smooth and unstained, its silence deeper than any judgment. The ritual has ended, not just for this couple, but for history itself. And as the shadows lengthen into stillness, you realize the chamber, at last, is private. The chamber grows softer in your mind now, as though the stone walls themselves begin to blur, dissolving into the quiet hum of night. You let go of the images of candles, sheets, and watchful eyes, and instead allow the silence to stretch, long and gentle, like a blanket pulled up around your shoulders. The tension that filled the medieval halls begins to fade, replaced by a calm, steady rhythm, the rhythm of your own breathing as it slows. You picture the echoes of laughter and prayers fading into nothing, as though carried off by a cool night breeze. The pressure, the scrutiny, the strange rituals, all of it drifts further away, leaving behind only the distant glow of memory. What was once heavy and oppressive is now softened, blurred into a story told in whispers. You feel yourself stepping back from that chamber, one step at a time, until it is no longer a place you stand in, but a picture folded gently into history. Your body feels heavier now, your eyes slower to open. You let the candlelight dim further, until the glow is little more than an ember. And then even the ember is gone. You're left in the warmth of quiet, safe from the weight of witnesses, free from the judgment of rituals long since ended. As your breath deepens, imagine lying not on a bed of trial, but on your own bed, soft, private, and entirely yours. No priest, no noble, no rumor waits at the door. Just silence and rest, and the comforting truth that the night belongs only to you. So let the shadows slip away, let the past close its eyes, and allow yourself to drift, slowly, peacefully, into sleep.